For further background about this webinar series in general, and today's topic in particular, I would like to introduce our colleague, John Wucher. At this point, we are now...
This is Edie. I definitely agree with that premise. I don't think that everyone... I think we're seen as a service, but I don't think we're seen as an authority, which is kind of interesting looking back at Bob's combination about leadership and service. But I think that they look to us as a resource. I don't think they're looking to us for guidance or a vision. And I think also many of them feel their own sense of authority and responsibility for their individual institutions and don't share the interest necessarily in collaborating or recognizing those benefits that, when you have the communal perspective, seem sometimes obvious.
Okay, so I think that question that John just raised is one that we really would like to hear from you about. As he said, this is sort of the premise that we've been going on, and if we're completely wrong about that, I think we would like to sort of hear from you about that. I wanted to take this opportunity to provide a brief Devar Torah, because I thought this week's Parsha just led to this so beautifully that there was really nothing I couldn't avoid it, to tell you the truth. Because if we're talking about the whole issue of leading without authority, in this week's Torah portion, we actually read about the challenges of leading with authority. And actually, in this case, we're talking about someone who's leading with the ultimate authority. And that is Moshe having this discussion with God about leading the Jewish people. And what is so interesting to me about this whole interplay is that, as I'm sure you're all aware, in this week's Parsha, we're going to see 5 different times during which Moshe is going to refuse this mission that he was charged with at the burning bush. 5 times he's going to argue with God about why he doesn't want to lead, and 5 times he's going to be overruled by God. His first 2 excuses are actually about his personal inadequacy. He then says things about the problems with the people. His 4th plea is once again about himself being inadequate. And the last one, which is really, in some ways so stark, is this blank, almost desperate refusal about not wanting to do it. And once again, we would probably be very happy to have the problem of leading with the authority of God on our side. But even then, there seem to be issues. So if we look at Moshe's first excuse, his problem, his argument, he says to God, Mi anochi ki elech. Who am I that I can go to Pharaoh? And if you look at the beginning of God's response over here in verse 12, you see he says, Vayomer ki eyeh imach. The answer is because I will be with you. And keep in mind that particular word eyeh, because it's going to show up in a few verses later. Because when Moshe says that if he does agree to this mission, he says that the people are going to ask him, so what is God's name? And if we look at verse 14, we have this really interesting response, which could take us months to try to analyze, but we're not going to do that today. We'll just read we'll read the response in verse 14. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, Vayomer ko tomar livnei Yisrael, Ehyeh shlachani aleichem. God said to Moshe, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. Translated here in this translation, I will be what I will be. And he said, so shall you say to the children of Israel, Ehyeh has sent me to you. I printed this particular version from the Chabad website because they have Rashi's translation, Rashi's comment here, and I think it's particularly relevant not only to that particular text but our discussion today. Verse 14 has a grammatical problem. The grammatical problem is, it says Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Ehyeh asher ehyeh, and then there's another Vayomer. Okay, so back in verse 14 there's a grammatical problem that Rashi and other people have pointed out. There's two Vayomers. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, God is speaking to Moshe, he says Ehyeh asher ehyeh, and then the next word again is Vayomer. So either this is a case of really bad editing, or there's another issue here. And some people, when they read this, understand this to mean that there were two conversations in this verse. There was Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Ehyeh asher ehyeh, and then something happened, that there was a conversation perhaps between God and Moshe, and then after that conversation, the second Vayomer, then God says, and Ko Tamar Livnei Yisrael Ehyeh Shlachani Aleichem. And of course, what also helps one to come to that conclusion is at the beginning of the verse, God says his name is Ehyeh asher ehyeh. At the end of the verse, he says, just tell them Ehyeh is my name. So something strange has happened. So how does Rashi, quoting from Brachot, Masechet Brachot, explain the situation? He says that there was indeed this unrecorded conversation with God, which really explains why there's this difference of the Ehyehs as part of it. And if we look at the Rashi over here, his explanation of Ehyeh asher ehyeh, he says, Ehyeh imam b'tzara zu asher ehyeh imam b'shvud shar malchuyot amar lefanav ribono shel olam ma ani maskir lahem tzara acheret dayam b'tzara zu amar lo yafeh amarta ko tamar. Alright, so the conversation goes as this. God says, I will be with them in this predicament, and I will also be with them when they will be subjugated by other kingdoms. That's why it's two Ehyehs. I am with them now in their tzuras, and I will be with them in the future in their tzuras. And Moshe, according to this Midrash, says to God, O Lord of the universe, why should I mention to them more trouble? They have enough problems right now being slaves in Egypt. God says to Moshe, you're right, basically, so just say, Ehyeh shlachani aleichem. The God of today who's dealing with your problems in Egypt is the one who sent you. So, without commenting on the numerous challenges with understanding that verse, I want to think for a moment back to this understanding of leadership that actually is displayed by Moshe in this conversation. Back to John's PowerPoint, the first four key leadership behaviors I think Moshe is exemplifying, and it's interesting because remember, this is the man who does not want to be the leader. Number one, Moshe is definitely on the balcony for this. He's really seeing things from a different perspective. He is also assessing the ripeness and the readiness of the Israelites to hear this message. He also understands who he's working with, who these people are, and he certainly is framing the intervention. He's addressing the intellect of the people and the emotion of what they would hear. And so I think that Moshe, the reluctant leader, is helping to lead God, lahavdil, in understanding how to really talk to the Jewish people at this particular moment. I think it's also very interesting that Rashi's explanation of the name here is a temporal one. It's a very practical one. The Rambam and others look very differently into how to understand this name of God. When I think about conversations with God, I'm reminded of the beginning of Akedat Yitzchak, in which God calls to Avraham, and Avraham responds with the word Hineni.